Hello everybody, it's Steve, it's me, and I'm out for a little bit of a walk. My legs are beat, but I need to go do a few things, and it's the weather's nice. It's a little bit breezy, which isn't always so good for the audio, but anyway, it's April 13th, 2021. You know what that means, another day, another story. But before we get to that, remember as always to like, share, subscribe. Hit up my Patreon, the link's in the description below. I'm always posting new stuff there for you in exchange for you helping me out. In addition to that, the link to my Instagram and Facebook pages are closely related to the content that I'm producing both here, as well as my primary channel, Steve the Amateur Story, in which you can watch these episodes on either channel. The links to those are also in the description below. So that said, let's talk about I guess you could say, kind of classic example of the mad, crazy inventor guy. So, there's a guy named Harry Riley who was living in Portland back in 1933. Harry Riley was, you could call him an inventor. I don't know really if he made anything beyond this, but he invented what was called in the newspapers. I've heard it referred to under different names, but back then they referred to it as the sawdust burner, which I guess it was a instrument that could transform sawdust into a better method to be used for burning so that it could be used to fuel things. That was Harry Riley's creation. So despite these apparently very creative and I guess you could say industrious, is that a word? Am I saying that right? I don't know. Anyway, despite his efforts, despite his creative efforts, Mr. Riley was apparently, I can assume, a pretty deadbeat, not so great husband. The reason I say that is by 1933 he was estranged from his wife Hilda, and like most men, once she left him and she went home, or she went, I don't know, maybe it was her childhood home, but she went to her parents' home, as was often the case back in the day, and I guess still today. But her parents lived in Burns, Oregon, which is in the kind of southeastern quarter of the state. It's, for where it's at, it's a pretty decent sized town, but it's kind of a hole in the wall at the same time. It's where my grandmother grew up, and it's just kind of this one little town surrounded by a whole lot of nothing. It was even more so back in 1933. So Hilda went back home to stay with her parents, and like most husbands, Harry Riley was frustrated, pissed. I don't know what his emotions were, but he made constant efforts to try to get his wife to come back to him, none of which had been successful. And finally he hightailed it all the way to Burns from Portland, which is a several hundred-mile trek. It's a pretty long journey, again, especially back then. So he arrives there, and once again this inventor pleads with his wife to return with him, and they go away from her parents and have this kind of private conversation. And when they emerge, she says, "I've agreed to go back with him." To this, her father replies, you don't do this unless you really want to. You don't have to do it. You don't have to do it, he says. And apparently a split moment later, Riley pulls out a gun, shoots his estranged wife and her father, both dead right there in their home in Burns, Oregon. Riley is then apprehended a short while later. So it's interesting. That's how the newspapers describe the story. Is she agreed to go back with him. Her father said, don't do this unless you want to. And then suddenly Riley shoots them both dead. I get the feeling maybe some more words were exchanged that weren't reported in newspapers. Maybe some things were a little more inflammatory that pissed Riley off more, that drove him to do the shooting. But of course the newspaper isn't going to want to give any detail, especially newspapers back then. They're not going to want to give any details that would make it look like somebody who kills two people remotely had a motive to do it. He's the killer, he's the bad guy, who cares what his motives are? So it was actually kind of common in newspapers back then to pretty much say, or at least manipulate a story and make it look like there was absolutely nothing that happened that instigated, you know. So a lot of these times when somebody would shoot somebody, you'd read the newspaper article and be like, I don't get it. Like, I know so-and-so was mad, but under these circumstances, why did that suddenly come about at that moment? And that's what's kind of baffling about this article, is why would this guy, you know, it doesn't seem like Hilda's father said that and she was like, oh, you know what, Dad, you're right, screw you, I'm not going home. And then he's like, well, this was the last, because, you know, I can understand him bringing a gun and saying, if she doesn't come with me this time, I'm going to kill her dead. And maybe take one or both of her parents with me. Fortunately, her mother was not there, so her mother was not also killed. And so it's a tragic story, and it's a bizarre case of a fairly, you know, well-renowned Oregonian who was an inventor. He created this rather prominent device, at least at the time. And, you know, the end of his road was murdering his wife and her father after this estrangement. And possibly the most intriguing, if not bizarre, aspect of this thing was the fact that, like, his defense when he went on trial. Because, of course, you do something like this, then you go on trial, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, yeah, that's right, I'm facing life in prison, so I may as well paint this in the best light possible. So his lawyers tried to present his situation as literally that of the crazed inventor. Like, they held no qualms about acknowledging that that was the situation. Was that this guy was a genius. They described him as a genius. We know his defense did. They were like, he was a genius that was able to invent things. But like most genius inventors, he was a little bit nuts. And his defense, you know, dug deep into his past and found that, you know, he had multiple grandparents that reportedly had mental illnesses, and they tried really hard to dig up any remote sketchy thing that anyone from Harry Riley's immediate, like, you know, family lineage, anything that was, you know, just bizarre, didn't even have to be completely mentally ill, they would use to their advantage and make it like he had this massive hereditary history of just everyone in his family just being mentally ill, which I think was probably a little bit of an exaggeration. But beyond just the oddity of someone who was a renowned inventor and then ends up committing a double murder, and then, you know, in the aftermath, what's, you know, equally as interesting, or maybe even more so, is the way that was used by his defense to present him as the crazed inventor, like he was Dr. Frankenstein or something. Maybe not to that extent, but that was kind of the direction they were pushing in. Like, this guy was so brilliant that he was nuts. And we see that by the fact that he was able to invent something, and by the fact that he had insanity in his family. And while certainly insanity can run in the family, so to speak, it doesn't automatically mean that's the case. You can't stipulate that someone's insane just because a couple people in his family were deemed mentally ill. You have to still prove that that specific said person is or isn't insane, and that was a driving factor in them doing what they did. And I don't feel like the defense actually successfully did that. They were hoping that they could just use the whole mad, crazed inventor thing to their advantage, and I don't think it was enough. When you commit a double murder like that, especially it seems premeditated. The guy brought a gun all the way from Portland to Burns to do this. It seemed like if Hilda didn't agree to come home with him, he was probably going to kill her, and I think the jury saw that. So Harry Riley was found guilty for his crimes. So Harry Riley didn't, at least as far as the jury is concerned, he didn't get his way. He didn't get his way in a lot of respects. Didn't get his wife back, and he didn't escape repercussions for murdering his wife and her father. And why should he? Just because you're an inventor doesn't mean the laws shouldn't apply to you. And a jury trial was not going to let you just walk for a seemingly unprovoked and probably premeditated double homicide. So it was the noose for Mr. Riley. I read, kind of scanning some information, that he did get a stay of execution, but he was ultimately executed. That was the thing. If you committed a murder, you were almost guaranteed to be found guilty back in the old days. But the trade-off was you were almost guaranteed to get a reprieve from time to time. So you'd end up having like 2 or 3 or 4 more trials before you finally were executed. That would happen as well. But this one, Portland inventor, who had, done a lot for people that were in the, a business where they needed, fuel to burn, and sawdust was their best fuel of choice. He was a trendsetter, an inventor, and yet his life ended with a noose around his neck because he was probably a pretty crappy husband, and his wife left him, and like a lot of them, he couldn't handle that. And that is the story altogether. Not really all that strange or intriguing for the simple case of, cases of men murdering their wives because they wouldn't come back to them after they were crappy husbands, or a dime a dozen back in the day in Portland. That happened, unfortunately, and insanely frequently. But what, made it so interesting was, again, it was a murder by the hands of a well-respected local inventor who, at trial, they tried to use that to their advantage. And, how often do you hear stories about someone who's an inventor and then it all ends for them by being hung, being put to death for the murder of their wife and her father? Let's not forget Hilda's father, who was just looking out for his kid and paid for it with his life, tragically. So I'd like to thank you as always. Sorry for the traffic, but I'm here. I can't help that there's a lot of traffic on this street right now. But as always, I'd like to thank you so much for watching and for supporting my channel. If you want to help it grow, remember as always to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon if you want to help me out that way. I'm always posting new stuff for you. The link to that is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my Instagram and Facebook pages, closely related to the content that I'm posting both here as well as my primary channel, Steve the Amateur Historian. I'm posting these This Day in History videos on both channels, so you can see them on either one. But all that said, this has been Steve, and I'll see you tomorrow.